today to be with us. He has to go back to Cleveland this evening, I understand. His name is David Giffels. This is his new book, Hardly on Purpose. We have copies here for only $8. You cannot beat that price. That's 10 cents less than the cost. We're eating the cost just for you. So if you want one, see me after the program, get it signed. It's a collection of linked essays about the quirky, hard-bitten cultural landscape of the Rust Belt, a subject familiar to all of us. People who thrive there, that's us. An assistant professor of English at University of Akron, David teaches creative nonfiction in the Northeast Ohio Master of Fine Arts program. His last book, All the Way Home, Building a Family in a Falling Down House, received widespread acclaim from New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and even Oprah's magazine. Top fantastic summer reads list. He is co-author of Are We Not Men, Are Devo, and Wheels of Fortune, the story of rubber in Akron. He was a longtime columnist for the Akron Beacon Journal and a contributing commentator and essayist at the National Public Radio Station in Kent, Ohio. He has written for the New York Times Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Grantland Parade. I think part of his book was in Parade last week. Redbook and many other publications. He's also the writer for, this is why most of you are here, Beavis and Butt-Head. His recent awards include the Cleveland Arts Prize for Literature, the Ohio Anna Book Award, and the National Society of Newspaper Columnists Award for Excellence. Please welcome David Giffels.
Thanks a lot. Am I on?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for being here, and to Sean for having me. It's an interesting day for me because I've been essentially on book tour in one version or another since the book came out on March 18th, and this is officially the last day of this part of my life. So as Sean mentioned, I have a reading in Cleveland tonight. So what I've been telling people, do any of you remember the Live Aid concert in 1985, this international effort to do this charity concert with rock stars from all over the world, and they had concerts at various sites around the world, and it was broadcast live on television, and I was a young man then, and remember specifically Phil Collins did this thing where he played in England, and then he took a Concorde jet to the United States and played another show in the same day. So it was like this intercontinental feat of superhuman power. So I've been telling people that, and in fact it was the mid-1980s, and so he talked by some sort of satellite phone during the Concorde flight to reporters on the ground. We thought this was like this thing, like this new thing. You could talk on a telephone from an airplane that was traveling at the speed of sound so that Phil Collins could play concerts on two continents. So I've been telling people that this is my Phil Collins Live Aid moment where I'm playing, doing West Virginia and then making it all the way to Cleveland. And I'm not telling people that I'm only about 1 minute outside of Ohio right now, but I've been so impressed because we don't get to be impressed by much in Northeast Ohio these days. So I got this email from Sean, and it was kind of like, hey, would you be interested in coming to do a reading in West Virginia? It's a place that has suffered from loss of industry, check. A lot of population loss, check. And strange weather, as he just mentioned, it could snow or it could be humid in the upper 80s, check. The only thing you're missing is a legacy of terrible professional sports teams. So I'm going to report here. Steelers? You might not making any friends with me. Oh yeah, WVU, of course. Yeah, that is the professional sports team. We have the same. It used to be said that there's really only one professional football team in Ohio, and it's the Buckeyes. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to read a small piece of it. And then would just love to have a conversation. But it's interesting to be here, as I said, because we do share a lot of similarities. And the whole reason I wanted to write this book is because I was a newspaper columnist at the Akron Beacon Journal for a long time. And a lot of what I wrote about for a while was the struggle that Akron and a lot of other cities like Akron were having with what we call brain drain. Basically, people of my generation have been flowing out of places like Akron and states like Ohio at a much greater rate than they've been staying. And so this loss of talented young people has been, kind of the national story of the Rust Belt for the past couple of decades. And so, I was interested in writing about that, and I did a lot of research and a lot of interviews about that, and wrote about it. And then it came time to write this book, and I had left the newspaper job and been thinking about these themes that had been part of my writing life for a long time. And one thing that started to strike me is I'm a native of Akron. I've never lived anywhere else. I've made my whole life there, my education there, and bought a house that was in need of tending. In fact, it was a nearly condemned old Tudor rubber executive's home for dirt cheap, and rehabbing it. And I knew a lot of people like me who had done this, who had committed to their Rust Belt hometowns and stayed there and made their life despite the difficulty of it, and not fled for Chicago or Phoenix or Seattle, a lot of the places that our friends went to. And I thought, I'm a very half glass full kind of person. So I started thinking about the demographics, and the decade I was born, in the 1960s, Akron's population peaked at 299,000. The last census in 2010, Akron's population was 199,000. And so the story is always that my hometown has lost essentially a third of its population in my lifetime. But the other side of that is, what about the 2/3 who stay? What about the people who commit, the younger people who commit to Wheeling and Akron? And what's their story, and why does that story not get told? Because as you know, places like ours, cities like ours, are usually either ignored or misunderstood. We're easy, the butt of easy jokes, or we're forgotten. In Ohio, we have this thing, we sort of cringe every 4 years because the national media kind of either ignores or misunderstands Ohio, and then about September, every 4 years during the presidential season, election season, all of these reporters come parachuting into Ohio and they want a quick hit answer, red or blue. And we're like, no. It's much more complicated than that. So the book is really then the story, it's my personal story, but it's also driven by an intention to tell the story of a generation of people who have committed to Rust Belt hometowns and why and what that means. So the piece I'm going to read, a lot of the book for that reason is very much about identity. I was born just at the end of the city as an industrial city, so I never knew this legacy that was kind of like the well-known legacy of Ohio. Do you know what Akron was known for? Rubber, of course. It's easy. And so you could say Akron is the rubber capital of the world, almost anywhere in the world, and people would at least know what that meant. And so there was this sense of kind of confidence that comes from that for people who live there. But to be born just as that's all ending, and to have grown up and come of age in a city that was struggling through the loss of that, was to grow up and identify with a place that was trying to find a new identity. And I didn't realize that at the time. I was young and dumb, but what I was coming to see was that how ingrained for people my age that idea of who are we and what are we, and what are we supposed to be, what that question is. The first essay in the book is about LeBron James, and it's not really an essay about basketball at all. It's about this person who came from us and became this international superstar and sort of a calling card of his own, and how important that was to even have that part of an identity. So the piece I'm going to read is actually about being a really dumb teenager, who's trying to understand who he is and where he comes from, by way of a radio song, which I'll read you, and then would love to just talk about your town and my town and whatever else you want to talk about. So it's called 867-5309, a love song. Sometimes my home really did feel like the middle of nowhere, or more accurately and worse, like a confounding void in the middle of somewhere. Everything of note that was from Akron was literally from Akron. If it became known, it was almost a given that it no longer existed here. The rock band Devo, transplanted to Los Angeles, referred derisively to their Ohio hometown as a good place to be from. Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, expatriated to England, wrote her long-distance ode to Akron, "My city was gone." Even Firestone, one of the city's signature corporations, motto, "The name that's known is Firestone," moved its headquarters away, and not once, but twice. First to Chicago, then back to Akron, then to Nashville, all within 4 years, as though to underscore and amplify its departure. It seemed that if anything had potential, it left. It began to seem necessary, the only option. Half my high school class was gone by the end of graduation summer, and the others trickled away, one after the next, after the next. And conversely, everything of interest came conspicuously from elsewhere. Whatever we saw on television, or heard on the radio, or read in a magazine, came from another place, and almost always the big cultural centers, New York, or Los Angeles, or occasionally Canada, which made us seem even more disconnected. So it was with considerable interest in the summer of 1982 that I heard this harmonized chorus, a song, a hit on the radio by the band Tommy Two-Tone, a song of obsession, of unrequited love for a girl named Jenny, whose number was found on a bathroom wall, 8675309. 867? I put my ear toward the radio. I heard it again, a startlingly familiar series of numbers. This was a local telephone exchange. And not just a local exchange, but the one in my own neighborhood. Everyone I knew in the blocks surrounding my house had a number that started with an 8. And most of them started with that very one, 867. Somebody had written a song about where I lived. And it was a good song, and it was a hit. My slowly emerging sense of art suggested that the most important songs were about real-life experiences, which was why everyone was so crazy about Bruce Springsteen, because everyone who listened to him literally had a hungry heart, and could therefore relate personally to his lyrics. But now, there was a song about a real-life experience that was not a familiar generalization. It actually referred to a specific aspect of my own life experience. America was vast and fascinating in its every region, infinite in its telephonic numerology, and the writer of that song, who was from California, could have picked any exchange to represent any place, or could have picked 555-5309 to represent every place, but he didn't. This Jenny person could be living a block away. Remember, I was only 17 years old. We knew what we had to do. We went to the basement, where a wall-mounted telephone was next to the washer and dryer, useful for teenage privacies. My older brother took his position as the overseer. I lifted the receiver and dialed 867-5309. Hello? I didn't have a lot of experience talking on the phone to girls, and so the notion of cold calling, particularly someone potentially famous, took all the nerve I could muster. Is Jenny there? Click. It would be years before I learned the full truth of the song. The co-writer, Alex Call, said in 2004 that he was looking for a simple pop hook, and something about the rhythm and syntax of those numbers found their way more or less randomly through his imagination. Quote, "Despite all the mythology to the contrary, I actually just came up with the Jenny and the telephone number and the music and all that just sitting in my backyard," he told an interviewer for songfacts.com. There was no Jenny. I don't know where the number came from. I was just trying to write a 4-chord song, and it just kind of came out. I made it up under a plum tree in my backyard. Under a plum tree in California. This would suggest the meaningfulness to catchiness ratio was approximately that of a wop, a woo, bop, a wop, bam, boom. Bruce Springsteen would later write a song called Youngstown about the actual Youngstown, with a love interest also named Jenny. It's a sad, sad song. Here in Youngstown, my sweet Jenny, I'm sinking down. The name was literal, drawn from local history, and is well known in that beleaguered city. Jenny was the town's nickname for the Jeannette blast furnace, part of a vibrant steel mill that shut down in 1977. Jenny sat rusting for 2 decades until its demolition in 1996, a year after Springsteen's song came out. This bold adherence to fact and emotional truth seemed almost like a make-up call from the songwriter community, but it was far too little and far too late for me. It took a while for the news to reach us, mostly because it wasn't really news so much as the opposite of news. But somehow that summer we learned that there were 867-5309s in lots of places. Apparently, the one that was getting all the attention was the home phone number of the daughter of the Buffalo chief of police, who was pretty unhappy about the whole thing. Which meant we were nobody again. We kept calling the local number from time to time because more than anything else, that's what teenage boys do. The same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But we never so much as got the satisfaction of being yelled at, and soon we learned that even that part of the unraveling myth was not exclusively ours. Apparently everyone in the area code who owned a radio had thought of the same prank. And before long, the 7 precious numbers resulted in 3 atonal beeps, followed by the sad, familiar refrain. We're sorry. You have reached a number that has been disconnected or is no longer in service. If you feel you have reached this recording in error, please check the number and try your call again. It was interesting. I feel sorry for children who've grown up with the internet because they can find answers to those kinds of questions so easily that they never take over and take on lives of their own. But when you're living in Akron, Ohio in the 1980s was like living in the wasteland because we had cable TV earlier than most of the country, I think because the country took pity on us, and so Akron was one of the early test markets for cable. But until then, it was kind of like if you found something out that was going on outside of what was immediately in the mainstream news or available to you, it was this vast mystery. And so I mentioned Canada as being one of the exotic places where the media came from. That's because, does anybody remember the TV show Second City Television?
Yeah.
In Akron, we were getting it on the local VHF station, and when anything that came in on the local VHF station late at night seemed like we had discovered this thing that only existed for us. And so in Akron, in the 8th grade, I remember me and my friends thinking we were the only people in the world who knew who John Candy was and how funny he was. And it was a shock to find out he was a star. So I'd love to take a question. Yes.
I do.
Okay.
Where did you go to school, and how hard was it for you to get a job?
That's a great question. The question is, where did I go to school and how hard was it to get a job? I went to the University of Akron for 3 degrees. Like most people who say they want to be a writer when they're studying, what you do is you just keep getting degrees. Because that's like saying I want to learn how to become invisible, but you can go to school for it. So I did. I went through school ever since I learned how to read. I always said when someone said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" I said I want to be a writer. But like I say, that's not sort of a set career path where you get a certificate into being a writer and then apply for a job. So So by the time I finished graduate school, I had refined that to mean I want to be a writer, and the only thing I know for sure is I don't want to write for a newspaper. And a week after I finished my graduate coursework, I started writing for a newspaper. And then I did that for 18 years. So I sort of literally, sort of just by a dumb connection from a friend who had just started working for a very small newspaper near Akron, said there's a job opening, and I had recently gotten married, and my in-laws were becoming nervous that I wasn't ever going to be employable because I was studying, English. So I took this job as sort of a stopgap to try to figure out my next move, whatever that was supposed to be, and worked for newspapers for 18 years. So that sort of dumb luck that kind of found its way. Very quickly I found I loved newspaper work, and it was really important to me and meaningful. But it was more, like I say, by a stroke of luck. So one of the things that's happened with this book is some people who've left cities like Akron, and Akron specifically, have gotten the impression that somehow I'm saying that they are less worthy because they left, or they were somehow not committed. And I never felt that way at all, because I know that, if not for that stroke of luck, I probably would have had to have gone somewhere else to find what I needed, because there's not an abundance of jobs in Akron. But to find a way and to make certain kinds of sacrifices to stay in a town like that, I think does give a certain kind of pride, and the title of the book is The Hard Way on Purpose, a sense that we did do things the harder way in some ways instead of just cashing out and going to an easier market. But I do understand people who left. In fact, I don't even understand LeBron James, another young professional who left Akron. I understand what he did. I don't like how he did it, but I do, I understand that instinct that's born in people who are from places like Akron. Just one other side note to that. I did a reading in Ann Arbor, and the bookstore had this shelf full of books about Detroit and Michigan. And if you follow publishing trends, like every other book in the last 2 years that came out was about Detroit, the plight of the dying American metropolis and all of this. And one of them was written by this guy named Mark Benelli, and his jacket bio it says something to the effect of, Mark Benelli was born in Lansing, Michigan in 1967. Like most people who were born in Lansing, Michigan in 1967, he now lives in Chicago, which is, sort of like the nutshell version of that same story. Everybody in places like that had to get out. I think there was a hand over here.
The book, is this your autobiography, or is it just parts of your...
It's a collection of essays, many of which are personal essays about my experience in that city and in that cultural era of the Rust Belt, but also some essays that are more about the themes and trends of the Rust Belt. There's an essay about the phenomenon of ruin porn, which is people, mostly photographers, taking pictures of dead American cities, or seemingly dead American cities. Detroit has been a real destination for photographers because it's fascinating to see these, it looks like Paris if it had been left to decay. So some things like that are kind of Rust Belt themes, so combination. Yes, sir.
When you were a newspaper reporter in Akron,
Mhm.
did you have a specialty, or were you wrote about a lot of things?
Most of the time, the question is, when I was a newspaper reporter, did I have a specialty, or was it broader than that? Well, I'll talk specifically. I was writing for a very small newspaper, and when I got hired at the Beacon Journal, I got hired. I took whatever job there was, to get my foot in the door. So I was hired at the Akron Beacon Journal as the society writer. At the same time, I was writing for Beavis and Butt-Head. So I had the oddest resume in Ohio, and nobody could. In fact, I remember one day my editor came over to me and she said she had overheard the managing editor bragging to one of his colleagues on the telephone that we have the only society writer in America who also writes for Beavis and Butt-Head. And I didn't even know what that meant. Like there would be another one. So I did that, and then just sort of wound my way through. Most of the time I was there, more than half of my time there, I was a columnist, a local news columnist, so I was writing about a lot of different themes, which I think was very much the foundation for this book, because I was thinking about a lot of the struggles and problems and triumphs and that of my town, and also thinking about it not just locally, but also how does this reflect national trends and experiences in other cities, which is, kind of what the intent of the book was. One of the things that made me the happiest when the book first came out, it was reviewed in the Minneapolis Star Tribune, and the headline said, Midwestern city that has fallen on industrial hard times and has terrible sports teams, ... and is not Minneapolis. And I thought that's the connection I wanted to make. That there's misery throughout the region, not just one.
What has replaced the industrial rubber sector as the employment in Akron now?
So what's replaced the industrial sector as employment? Akron, one reason I was interested in writing about Akron is it's a really interesting Rust Belt city because it was self-contained. The rubber industry was, the four major American tire companies were headquartered there. For a lot of the 20th century, most of the manufacturing was there. All of the research and development, the science was there. The International Union of the Rubber Workers was founded and headquartered there. So it was self-contained, and nobody else had it. We only had steel, but so did Pittsburgh, and so did Cleveland, and so did Youngstown, and a lot of other places. So Akron makes this really clean model, and when it imploded almost all at once. So Akron really hit its Rust Belt bottoming out a little bit sooner than a lot of the other cities, which still had, kind of other things going on. So for that reason, it's interesting then to follow the upward trend and how it crawled back out of that. One of the saving graces, first of all, Goodyear is still based there. The largest American tire company is also the only one that didn't leave, and a major employer, one of the largest employers in the city. But also because the research and development was there and was based not only within companies but also at the University of Akron, that allowed for this blossoming of polymer research, which is closely related to rubber research. And Akron is now, the university is a world-class center of that type of research and science. So there's a lot of smaller industry that's based on polymers. But it's still struggling. Jobs are still an issue in Akron as they are, I'm sure, in Wheeling. And so it's not like something has replaced it, but it's just kind of like this struggle to come back that's really been the story of the last 25 years or so. John?
Yeah, two questions. One was most of your book tour in Rust Belt cities, and
Yeah.
do you ever get a sense that some Rust Belt cities feel like they're more Rust Belt than other ones?
I know, isn't it funny, like once you have a theme of misery, it's like a game of one-upmanship to see who can be more miserable. Like my whole thing, one of my theories about Akron is, like for instance, Akron has this reputation, it's the second cloudiest city in America. That's meteorologically true. And I'm like, you can't even be first, in the number of the few sunny days we have. I went to, there's an essay here about attending one of the many infamous Cleveland Browns playoff losses. And what distinguished this game is that at the time it was the second coldest NFL playoff game ever played. And again, why? Like, we couldn't be the coldest. And so, yeah, I would hear this a lot, like, well, you don't know how hard you've had it. We've had it worse. So, yeah, Pittsburgh tells that story well. I think Pittsburgh sort of owns that. Partly because Pittsburgh, I think, is the most successfully recovered Rust Belt city, so they can, sort of play their blues more joyfully. But I usually have a lot of comeback material, so I make my case. So yeah, but what's been interesting though has been to compare stories, like to come here and just even to get a quick kind of, from Sean, a quick kind of snapshot of Wheeling's story and to hear the similarities and there is, you know, part of that competition is also this, we've been the same places, you know, we sort of do understand each other pretty well. And we also recognize that a lot of people don't understand us, so that bonds us. Yes.
David, one of the things that Akron is famous for is the great dirigibles that were made there, the Akron Beacon and the Shenandoah. In fact, Wheeling was the last major city over which the Shenandoah passed before it crashed to the west of your neighbor, Ohio.
Yeah.
I understand that in the dirigible hangars, they had their own weather systems, that clouds would form and it would actually rain inside the hangars. Could you talk about those great dirigibles and those dirigible hangars?
Yeah, I love that subject. The first book that I co-wrote was it was the history of Akron's rubber industry, and I got to do all the research on the blimps and the writing about that. So I'm fascinated by it. The facility you're referring to is the Akron Air Dock, which is one of the things I love about Akron is it's quintessentially weird. It's got all these things that are kind of science fiction-ish, but they're real. And one of the most notable ones is this Akron Air Dock, which is this massive black dome that for much of its history was the largest structure in the world without internal supports. So it was just this shell that was brilliantly engineered to build these giant airships inside. And one of the myths about Akron, and another one of these weird science fiction things, it was like a B movie, like a Roger Corman movie, because if you knew this ominous black thing, hulking thing, that most of us never were inside, and somebody would tell you it's so big inside that it has its own weather. You know, especially as a young person, you go, that's Jules Verne. You know, and so the truth is, apparently it can get humid in there in a much different way than it is outside, but it doesn't actually rain inside. But the story I want to believe, you know, now that I'm not a working journalist, I feel like I can tell the myths as truth. So I still tell people I think it rains inside, since I don't know the actual. Yeah.
Is there any reaction to the fact that the newest Whittier airship is in effect import?
Well, it's not an import. It was built in Akron.
I know it was built there, but German airship.
Yeah, but you know, all that technology came from the Germans anytime. Anyway, but he's talking about the new. You guys know way too much about our blimps. That's like our stuff. There's a new blimp that's been built, and it's all new technology, and it's a huge problem for those of us in Akron, especially people who've been around for a while, because one of the joys of living in Akron is that we could say, you know, like in the rest of the world, the Goodyear blimp is the thing that flies over the Super Bowl. In Akron, it's the thing that flies over on a random Tuesday afternoon, because there's one base there. So and in Akron, you hear this drone on any given day, and everybody in town would know exactly what that was. The blimp is flying. It doesn't sound like anything else. It sounds like if you took a yacht and suspended it above your head and had it moving really slow. And so, you know, and no matter how many times in your lifetime you've heard it, everybody looks up and waves. That's like an Akron thing. This new airship, because it's all new technology, it doesn't make that sound. And so it's been weird. It's only, I think it just launched at the beginning of the year. And I kind of realized about a week ago, you know what, I have not heard the blimp, like in months. And usually it's, you know, not a week or so goes by. So it's really disappointing and kind of unnerving that all of a sudden this thing that I always knew about isn't making its noise. You know, I don't know where it is.
David, one more comment on the dirigibles. Of the four great dirigibles, the Akron, the Macon, the Shenandoah, and the Los Angeles, the only one that didn't crash was the Los Angeles, and that was made in Germany.
Okay. One thing I learned when I was writing about airships is don't ever challenge an expert, whether he's wrong or not, because they are the ones that I'm not casting aspersions here, but there was this crazy old man in Akron who knew everything, like down to the number of rivets. And if you got anything wrong, you could expect a flaming letter from this guy. And it was always handwritten in really dense script, and so we would have those tacked up to our cubicles as little badges of honor. I got something wrong. This lady.
Friends of mine, their father was a chemist for Goodrich, and when I met him 40-some years ago, the first thing he said was, "Yes, I work for Goodrich. We don't have a blimp."
Yeah. Yeah. I always like they had the most Akron motto of all, which was "We're the other guys." That's what it means when you come in second all the time. We're the other guys. There's a quote. One of the epigraphs in the book is from Joshua Cribbs, who played for the Cleveland Browns and graduated from Penn State. So he was very much kind of like we thought of him as one of our own. And it was just a random game story the next day after one of the Browns' many losses, and he said. We almost won. We almost always almost win. But that's it in a nutshell. I don't know if he knows what poetry he just uttered, but I grabbed out. Yes, ma'am.
How many Goodyear blimps have there been, and when was the first one actually built?
I should ask the guy. I should know this, shouldn't I, since I just bragged that I was a researcher. I forget the number. It was many, because when they were built for war purposes, they were observation blimps, and so Goodyear just cranked these things out during World War II and even post-war. So there were many, and I couldn't tell you the number. They didn't take on their advertising form until more like the 1960s. Now there are 3, and they're based strategically so that they can be flown to mostly sporting events, but the kinds of places we're familiar with them. So.
Well, I asked that because in 61, I think it was, I wrote in a Goodyear blimp down in southern Florida, but I didn't know how many of them were in operation at that time.
When was this?
Actually, it was more like 62.
Yeah, there would have been more going around at that time, but it's a pretty unique experience, isn't it? Yeah. I've been up 6 times. That's in Akron, that's a big brag. But it was always, because they can't, a private citizen can't like buy a trip on a blimp. It's used mainly for like they entertain their customers, media, which is how I got to go up 6 times, because I would strategically plan some reason I needed to be on a blimp for my reporting purposes, just so I could be on a blimp. So. And then they'll sort of treat people, to flights in one way or another. How did you get on one?
It was on, well, I was in southern Florida going to school, and I don't know, somehow they were taking people up one afternoon from Miami Beach.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know if it was unusual.
It's not like any other flight or transportation experience, because you're moving very slowly. It feels like you're in a boat, but you're in the air, and you're not really hovering. You're floating, but you're also propelled, and you move like this a lot. It's like riding inside of a whale up in the sky.
It's like riding in a rocket chair.
Yeah, like riding in a rocket chair. Exactly. Yeah. Gentlemen.
About 10 days ago, I saw your poster for your book. We had a local art festival. And I thought the title was Hardware on Purpose. Okay, I just saw it. I saw the whole sign, and I said, that sounds interesting. And I'll go check this out. And it wasn't until after I got here that it's actually, that wasn't the title. But I am curious about how your title did come about and about the book illustration on the cover.
Oh, okay. Hardware on Purpose, I think would be, like, I would immediately be interested in that book. but I'm not sure why.
I didn't know either.
Like, if you're not going to use that, can I keep that? So how did the title come about? It sort of came about, titles are so hard. And this one, the phrase appeared in what I knew would become the first essay. But it just seems to me that for people like me, and I think probably like us, that when you've lived in a place like this and you've seen it in decline, but you stick it out, it's not just that doing things the hard way is necessary in a lot of ways, because you have to work harder for certain kinds of things, but it becomes sort of the way, your worldview. It's the way you do things, and in fact you take a certain, almost like an aesthetic from it, like doing things the hard way is more meaningful because that's how we've done them, and doing things the easy way isn't necessarily the best way. And so the hard way on purpose. The epigraph that opens the book is a quote from Studs Terkel. It's practical to hope. And I really like that because I think of myself as a very optimistic, very hopeful person, but his treatment of hope is not that it's this romantic thing or this desperate thing, it's that it's practical, you know, and there's something about the hard way that's about that. So then the question is about the image on the cover, which I'm glad you asked because there's a really great sort of inside baseball story about this. About a year ago, I was in New York at the publisher, and I was going to get to see the first treatments for the book cover. The art department had been working on it, and I hadn't seen any of the concepts for the book cover, and there were several. And so the one that my editor himself had actually thought of, which he was really fond of, you know, because an editor who has an idea believes that that's the best idea that there is, because that's how editors think. So, and actually, I really liked it in concept as well when I had heard about it, which was it's kind of a similar layout, but instead of this sign, it was one of those round brick factory smokestacks that are so ubiquitous in Akron and probably in Wheeling too, with the company name letters down vertically. And so it was this, so when he laid them out on his desk, here are these different treatments, and here it is, the one he likes the most. And it's this vertical shaft with the hard way on purpose written down it. And I was there and I was looking at it, and I said, Brand, it looks a little phallic. And he really wanted this to be the book cover. And he said, nah, that's just you. I think this is more of a reflection on you than it is on this tree. So we started calling in some people from around the publishing house to come in and just kind of take a what do you think? And slowly it was like, that doesn't look so much like a smokestack as it looks like something else. And so it was like, I've seen Brandt's confidence grow. And I said, Brandt, the more we look at it, the more I'm seeing this giant shaft, and all I'm seeing is hard and hard. I didn't know I'd be playing blue at a luncheon. And so he came out. So the artist went to work on this concept, and I really loved it. I mean, it looks like what you see, and it looks like what I saw when I drove into Wheeling today. The kinds of architecture and the kind of authenticity that's in places that have kept, old-looking stuff like that, and not because it's being preserved for gentrification purposes. It's just part of who we are. And in downtown Akron, there's signs like that. And the other thing I really liked about it is, if you have a copy of the book, the finish on the sign is rough and gritty, and the back cover, and then the sky is sleek and shiny. And there's something about that that's, I think, very much about the way I understand my place. It has this grit, but it also does have this positive sheen to it. I'll leave it at that.
On the practicality of hope,
Yes?
you just talked a little bit, to benefit of the audience, about the positive thing, the comeback that is Akron, as an encouragement to the city, which we are making a comeback.
Yeah.
And there's a whole lot of us who are believing in that, and we are leaving misery behind, and gladly, and we're moving forward. And so I know a lot of great things are happening with downtown and with the architecture that's there, and new things that are happening that revitalize. So if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that there's a strong preservation community here, as there is in Akron, and I think that as there is in lots of these kinds of cities. I'll tell you a brief anecdote. When I was in high school and first gaining this sense of my place and what it meant, I had a job for a landscaper, my first, one of my summer jobs. And he got a contract for the city there was some kind of a street project going on, and he got a contract replacing all the tree lawns in one of the residential neighborhoods. This neighborhood called Highland Square, which is full of old, kind of historic, but middle-class type houses. And this was in the early 1980s, and many of those places were in disrepair or transition. And what I realized, and so by virtue of the work that we were doing, we were moving very slowly down each sidewalk, city block by city block, planting grass. And so it gave me time to sort of linger in front of each house. And what I now recognize I was seeing it, is I was seeing how carefully tended these houses were. And there was something attractive about that to me, even to my burgeoning, not yet domestic or, sort of grown-up self, that, to own a house that needs you is meaningful, more meaningful than to own a house that doesn't need you, that's self-perpetuating. And so as I grew older and more committed to staying in Akron, that became something that was really interesting to me, the idea of saving a house. Because what that does is, first of all, it's just economically prudent. It's much cheaper to buy an old house. You don't learn until later it's not much cheaper to maintain one, but by then it's too late. But when you're in a community of people who are doing that, you realize that a city that needs you you mean more to it than a city that doesn't need you. And I use Phoenix as an easy punching bag, but Phoenix doesn't really need you. In the same period that I talked about earlier, where Akron has lost a third of its population, Phoenix has gone from 400,000 people to 1.4 million people. And my punchline to that is that all 1 million of those people came from Akron. But they're meaning, they don't mean as much to the city. So just through this process of a generation of people in my age range who've been staying and committing, most of my friends live in old houses, who live in the city that they are restoring or maintaining. And so to now have a generation of people who that's our story, not a story of loss, but a story of careful tending and rebuilding, that starts to generate a new culture. And I'm sure that Wheeling has a similar thing that Akron has. Because there's been a lot of population loss and not a lot of new people coming, you tend to have old ideas that stay stuck. And some of those old ideas aren't really true anymore, but this old idea that we lost so much, we're done losing. And what we're doing now is finding a way to reinvigorate and to slowly rebuild. And then you'll get one example of that that's a real success, and that gains traction. And another one will build on that. And so it doesn't just happen with residences, it happens with other kinds of physical spaces, old factories that have been abandoned that get adapted for a new use, and then new kinds of business that starts to define the city. So I think it takes a generation, and I think in Akron we're in a generation that's is moving upward, and I hope that Wheeling is in that same spot. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
And following up on that discussion, if you plot the population of Wheeling from 1800 to today, you get a sine curve. And it's a very predictable curve, and you can predict when it goes down to 0, which is 2042. And so that's our destiny according to pure mathematics, unless we change it. And there's a lot of effort with young people here, as we talked about, people making efforts to really change it, to make Wheeling continuing to be a good place to live. So what is Akron going to look like in 2042?
Well, everybody from Wheeling will have to have moved to Akron if you're going to be 0. We're going to be the bustling town of West Virginia, which is what Akron was in the 1920s. So, Akron was this destination for West Virginians. Pardon? It's the route, what used to be Route 21, that's now 77. It was the saying was reading, writing, and Route 21 to Akron was the 3 R's of West Virginia. So You know, that's really interesting because in the last, you know, the mayor of Akron, who's been the mayor since the Rust Belt began, he's one of the longest serving mayors in the country, and a big part of how Akron has kind of stayed its course. But he really bristled at that last census when Akron's population dropped below 200,000, which was a psychological threshold. And in fact, the number in 2010 was exactly the number in 1910. And so if you talk about that same sine wave, you're saying in 1 century, from 1910 to 2010, we've gone from this number up to this number and back down to this number. And that looks like you're going all the way down to 0. When in fact, if you look at what happened to make that number go to where it was, it almost all happened during the 2 world wars, when Akron went from being this, you know, sort of smallish industrial town to just exploding in not so positive ways, in very polluted ways, in ways that a lot of housing had to be built very quickly and not very well, in ways that the city didn't really get to plan for its growth. It just kind of throw it where it landed. And so there's a lot of Akron that's still kind of a mess in terms of its planning and its configuration, and it was overcrowded. And even when it built out to handle the overcrowding, it's almost like, so, you know, me being the glass half full person, is it too small now or was it too big then? And I think, you know, some of that can be said even of Detroit. Is Detroit dying, or is it just like right-sizing, to use a term from corporate jargon? But I think it's, you know, so I think Wheeling probably has kind of the same trajectory. It doesn't go back down to 0. It finds its place. Youngstown is doing something really interesting. The mayor, I can't think of the name of the plan off the top of my head, but the mayor came up with this plan to aggressively compress Youngstown, which has lost a lot more. I mean, it's a really struggling city, but to compress what's left of the population into a city that makes sense. And so there's some, you know, plans to strategically raise neighborhoods. Detroit's doing some of that too. And I think that's a really smart way to look at how that's chipped out.
One thing I noticed, I lived in the Akron area for 13 years, and it seems like the western edge of Akron even spills over into Medina County, where a lot of people have moved out of Akron. I live clear down the southern Medina County, down by Wadsworth, and a lot of my neighbors would commute to Akron.
Yeah.
They worked in technical fields. And of course, Akron had a lot to draw people in on weekends. They had a civic theater, they had a Tuba Christmas, they've got the new canal park down there and the ballpark. There's a lot of things to do and see.
Yeah, a lot of that story is the story of suburbanization too. A lot of Akron's population loss isn't just people like, you know, going off into, they moved out into the suburbs, but which isn't to say that it's, you know, that's I mean, there's still been a general regional population decline, but that is true.
Also, another thing I noticed, in 1976, they had a real bad rubber strike up there.
Yeah.
And the automatics had almost shut down. In fact, they went down with the 4 tires on a car and no spares. And I noticed right after that, it seemed like the rubber companies, just somebody threw a bomb in the middle and they just exploded and moved away from Akron.
I need to give you a copy of Wheels of Fortune. The 1976 was the pivotal year, and I wrote about that rubber strike, and I just find it fascinating. I mean, it's epic. It's the, you know, bigger than life personalities, which is what a lot of the unions had at the time, and the companies. At the same time that foreign competition is kind of starting to mature, and American corporations still thought of themselves as the mighty, you know, impenetrable fortress, when in fact it's all crumbling, and then you have this very powerful union that was used to these bruising battles. It has this landmark strike, and you're right, and just, it was like the whole thing it just collapsed under its own weight, almost like in that single summer, you know, of 1976, and yeah.
Let's do one last question.
One last, so this lady hasn't had a chance.
I have more of a comment than a question. I just want to thank you for defining what I feel about Wheeling. I moved here 4 years ago after 23 years in a seaside village in Connecticut, and I've lived all over the country. And I love Wheeling, and I've never felt that way about anywhere else love, a sentiment.
Yeah.
And it is partly because of the struggle you feel in Wheeling that really needs me a little. And thank you. That's been great.
I have to ask real quick, because this is, when people tell you, those of you who've lived in Wheeling for a long time, when people say they moved here from somewhere else, what's the first thing you say?
Why?
We do the same thing in Akron. And it's just, but it's not like, why would somebody do such a thing? It's more like, how did you know? You know, I know I've been through Wheeling before, but, you know, I was coming here today with sort of intent. And I have to say, and this is not like just blowing smoke, as soon as I drove in, I went, this is a real place. This feels exactly like the towns that I feel like, that I always could just feel the soul when I drive in. And I think Akron has that too. So I think that's what you found here, that's counteracts leaving a seaside town and was a Cape Cod. So, yeah. Thank you so much for coming. This is great. If you want to like sign, if you want to stick right here.
Here to tell you about a happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books, that's booksy, hooksy, hacksy, fracksy, yells and sings, rocks and swings with boring Billy. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yodeling. Hey, yodie, 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 hey, yodie, yodie, take away. Mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pot. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.